to show us that we have always been dependent on God's grace and power, that it's always been about us being dependent on God's grace and power. What do I mean by that? And part of the problem is we often misunderstand the Old Testament narrative. I think Paul was exactly right to reach where he reached, but I think he could have reached for a lot more. Here's what I'm saying. Let's think of Noah. How was Noah rescued? Was it because he was such a great guy? You may have heard that. He was a preacher of righteousness. Well, he was that, but he was still a sinner because Noah got off the boat, got drunk, and got naked. Did you read that part? Noah was not perfect, okay? It was by the grace of God that Noah was warned of an impending flood. It was by the grace of God Noah had the strength to build the boat for 75 to 100 years or whatever it was. It wasn't all Noah's power. That was God's power. Abraham, we're very familiar with this because Paul has locked into Abraham in the book of Galatians, but it was by grace that God called Abraham to trust him, to leave the place of his lineage. And then it was by grace that God gave him Isaac, the child of promise. It was by God's power that Isaac was born to a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman. It's the only way that happens. And that was the point. That was the point. And in case we didn't get it with Sarah, all of the patriarchs' wives struggled with fertility. Rebecca, okay, so who's the child of promise? Isaac, he marries who? Rebecca. Also struggled with fertility, needed God's grace and power for Jacob and Esau to be born, by grace. Jacob then marries a girl named Rachel. Guess what? Also barren. It's only by God's grace and power that Joseph is born. And then Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, is sent into Egypt. You guys know that whole story. And it was by their family ends up being saved by God's grace and favor upon Joseph in Egypt. It wasn't because Joseph was great. It was because God gave him a supernatural ability to interpret dreams so that this guy, that was this foreigner in the Pharaoh's jail, gets brought into the Pharaoh's court and ends up with the Pharaoh's signet ring on, giving orders. That's the grace of God. That's the favor of God at work. And it was because of that Joseph was in a position to save his little nomad family and bring them into Egypt from the famine. You understand? It was all God's grace. And then when the Pharaohs kind of forgot about the fact that they made it because of Joseph and enslaved the people, they were delivered by God's grace. God sends Moses, but it's by his power that 10 plagues come in succession to break down the Pharaoh to the point that the crescendo of that being the death of the firstborn. And in that, there being an incredible picture forward-looking of the gospel where they take the blood of lambs and put it over their doorpost so that death angel passes over their home. It's by God's grace that it wasn't, do you understand? Look, if salvation was by works, here's how the story would have went. And the Hebrews finally got mad enough and realized there was more of them than the Egyptians, and they all took their hammers and chisels and stonemason tools, stood up, and slaughtered the Egyptians. That's how it would go. Is that what happened? No. God showed up and did miracles. God showed up in the might of his power that they were sent out. And then when Pharaoh and his deranged self changed his mind, God miraculously parts a Red Sea. Just in case anybody thought that God wasn't involved in this, let's make sure everyone knows this narrative depends on the grace and power of God alone because a sea split in half. In case you could have chalked the rest up to weather and, the frogs and the locusts and the gnats and all the rest and the hail is like, well, that could have all happened naturally. Seas don't split naturally and close up exactly at the right time to wipe out the army trying to kill you. God's grace, God's power. And then the people of Israel don't survive in the wilderness by their own strength, by their own survival skills, do they? No, but by the gracious provision of God, because water flows out of the rock of Horeb and manna lands on the ground every day for them to eat. Again, the message being dependence on God's grace, dependence on God's power. Oh, it's always been there. They don't survive the mission to spy out the promised land by their own strength, but by God's providential grace, they run into Rahab, who hides them. They'd have been dead. But God organizes something else. Joshua and the rest don't move into the promised land by their own strength. Do the children of Israel run in and use their Bronze Age weapons to knock down the walls of Jericho? Is that how that goes? The first fortified city they run into is they're trying to come in and inhabit the land? How does the walls of Jericho go down? By the power of God, by the grace of God. Gideon didn't defeat the Amalekites by many men or their might, but he did it with 300. Why? By the grace of God, to show the power of God, to show our dependence on God, that this was going to always be about what he can do, not what we can do. Ruth didn't join the family of Israel by her cunning or beauty. It was the grace of God shown to her through Boaz. And Boaz only had the blessing of a family because of the grace of God shown to him through Ruth. God orchestrated all that was necessary for Ruth to, here's the words you'll find in that book, just so happened to end up in the field of Boaz. The children of Israel didn't defeat the Philistine giant by their own strength and power, but God empowered a shepherd boy named David, and he delivered them by his grace, showing them again it was going to be his power. It was going to be his grace. It was always going to be him. It was going to be God sending the deliverer. Elijah didn't defeat the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel by his own power. It was by the power of God alone. Nehemiah couldn't have returned to build the walls of Jerusalem without God's favor being shown to him through the Persian king Darius. It didn't go like that. It's not normal for a king who's ruling over exiles to have such favor on a guy. He's like, yeah, here's all the notes you need to not only travel safely to go back and build the walls of your city, but also here's some stuff to make sure you got the materials. That's grace, that's favor. That wasn't Nehemiah. That was God doing what he did. Radshak, Meshach, and Abednego would never have survived the fiery furnace without the gracious protection of God. They weren't superheroes. God protected them, and the same goes for Daniel in the lion's den. Why am I doing this? Did you forget already? I'm trying to tell you, Paul could have flipped into the Hebrew Scriptures just about anywhere. He could have thrown a dart in there and found the principle that it's by God's grace and power, and it always has been.